We couldn't bring ourselves to support Hamas. I mean, can we pick and choose when people make a democratic choice?
Well, that's the tough question. I mean, in Quebec, for example, you know, we have seen over time a PQ government elected from time to time, and everybody goes into a frenzy. Even now in the House of Commons, there are many people who sort of taunt the Bloc for saying, why are you here? And there's a kind of there's this perception, try to attempt to create the perception that there's an illegitimacy to the Bloc, to which one can only say, look, I don't agree with these guys, but they've been elected, and there's been a fair election. They're here like everybody else, and we're not going to charge them with treason, and we're going to carry on. I mean, we can argue about whether the election in Gaza was really totally free and fair. We can also look at how Hamas treats other people and treats people who don't agree with Hamas, and there's a lot of evidence that they are quite brutal in suppressing opposition groups. Like, they don't just sort of say they're going to cut off their funds; they actually kill them. So it's a different,
a tough neighborhood.
It's a different perspective. But I do think it's something we have to live with, and I think this is one of the tensions we're going through in Egypt today. You can see it on one of the undercurrents that we're trying to deal with is everybody wants to have free and fair elections. What if they pick the wrong guy? And that's a challenge. I mean, that's one of the things we have to realize. But the broader issue for me is one of the things we have to understand is that democracy is not just about elections.
Right.
Democracy is about how you treat people after the election. Democracy is about institutions. Democracy is about human rights. Democracy is about how do institutions really function. And there's a bit of a tendency today to sort of say, well, we had in the kind of the literature on democratic governance, there's a phrase that people use as the mistake is bullets, ballots, and bolt.
Yeah.
You have the armed conflict, the UN or the US or somebody comes in and says, okay, we end of this fighting, let's have an election. And then as soon as the election's over, you get the hell out and see, hope that everything works out. Well, that's really not what the governance world is all about. It's about courts, it's about, I mean, when we think about our own democracy, as much as I don't like the current government, federally, in the federal level, and municipal. I like the provincial government, okay. You say, well, we still have a lot of protections in this country. We still have a lot of institutional ways in which we assume that when the police knock at our door, they're not going to just drag us away. They're going to tell us what it's all about. And they're going to talk about, well, what do you think happened? And we've been through this great debate about the G8 and the G20, and it's been a very healthy debate, I think. I think we've gone through a very healthy discussion about what the heck happened here. How did this happen?
Right.
And I think that's been a great discussion in the city. But we have to understand that when we talk about democracy in Egypt, we're not just talking about majority rule. We're talking about what happens to minorities. I mean, 10% of Egyptians are Christian. What happens to them? What happens to them now? What happens to them later on? Do we have the rule of law? Then there's the whole other question which people frequently don't even think about when they talk about democracy is what's the economy look like? How does the economy run? Do people have economic rights? And at the same time, how does the public sector organize? And how do government institutions run? And what's the balance between public and private and all that? I mean, one of the problems of the democracy debate is that it became very associated in the rhetoric with George Bush's agenda. So his agenda was an American Republican, very neo-con kind of agenda. But frankly, that's not the exclusive definition of what a democracy is supposed to be like. A democracy can include public ownership. I mean, we have hydro. I mean, we have public ownership in Ontario. We consider that to be, part of our balanced model that people talk about. So those are all part of the puzzle.
Just briefly, because there's so much.
Are you suggesting I'm talking too long?
it's your show, and
that's right.
I mean, you're just eating into selling time, so
that's right.
it's not my book. I have no royalties from this. I don't even get paid for being here. No, but both your party and the Conservative Party agreed on the Hamas issue, and of course, in Hamas, and you write a lot in the book about gunboat diplomacy, exporting democracy at gunpoint. But we actually went beyond that and supported anti-democratic forces at gunpoint in Gaza. Do you think that was a mistake? Do you think that a liberal government in the future might revisit that?
Well, I think Gaza is complicated. I think the complexity is that you've got in Hamas, you've got a group that continues to practice the politics of resistance. Resistance to the idea of Israel, resistance to the idea that there is a Jewish presence in the Middle East, which under the Hamas ideology they don't like or want or think is just or fair or reasonable. And you know, we made an existential decision as a country a long time ago that we supported the idea that there would be a Jewish presence in the Middle East, that there would be a Jewish state, a state which the Jewish people would be a majority, and which they'd be able to express their culture. We made that decision in 1947 when we supported the partition of Palestine, the old British Mandate of Palestine, and we supported the creation of the State of Israel. Now, having done that, my view is that we should be as supportive of the new state of Palestine as we have been of the State of Israel. Right. And I think the mistake that we've made, and I think one has to say the mistake I think Mr. Harper is making, is that he's telling Canadians you have to choose between the Israeli narrative and the Palestinian narrative. And I think what Canadians really believe is that no, we have to find a way to reconcile these two narratives and to encourage those two groups of people to continue to live in peace. Now, this is not an easy thing to do because one has to accept that, for example, in Hamas's charter, as I point out in the book, there are not only reference to, but there are quotes from the Articles of the Elders of Zion. And you say to yourself, this is one of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is one of the most anti-Semitic conspiracy doctrines that's been floating around the world for, you know, a long time. And thanks to the internet, it's back in a big way. And we have to say, you know, guys, this is just complete nonsense. I mean, why would you continue to perpetrate this? At the same time as we have to say to some in the Israeli political community, and I've been to the Middle East many times over the last 3 years, and just say, look, you cannot have a Jewish state unless you have a Palestinian state, because if you insist on having it all in very short order, you won't have a Jewish state anymore. You will be living in a place that will have a majority of Palestinians. So what have you got? What are you going to live in? Permanent occupation of other people's narrative and story and rights? And you can't do that. And I happen to think, I mean, I'm a continual optimist. I mean, I think there is a substantial number of people in the Israeli political community who understand that completely, who agree with it, who embrace it. They're struggling with how to get there, but they will get there. And I thought it was very interesting, for example, last week, that after a lot of anxiety in Israel about what was going on in Egypt, I mean, and there's a huge concern, because you got to understand what happens in Egypt affects what happens in Gaza, it affects what happens in Jordan, it affects what happens on the West Bank. And this is all connected one to the other. And if people don't understand that, then they're not understanding. So there's a lot of anxiety about what is this all going to mean. And Prime Minister Netanyahu said on Thursday, he said Israel has nothing to fear from democracy in Egypt. We're willing to engage with a democratic Egypt. And that's a very important statement. Right. Now, it took a while to get it out of him, but he did it, and he said it. And it's a very important fact that he said it. I'm going to conclude that you're probably more Burke than Payne on this, but anyway.